establishment of a new.
Okay.
Yeah. Labor is aware that the only compensation for the cost of this war is the establishment of a new order in which liberty, equality, and fraternity will not be mere slogans but will become facts of life, said the Honorable Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Member for Labor, Government of India. Broadcasting recently on why Indian labor is determined to win this war from the Bombay station of All India Radio. Here is the full text of Dr. Ambedkar's broadcast. There is to be a series of broadcasts by persons who are connected with and interested in labor. My talk tonight is the first of this series. The subject of my talk is of a general sort. It is to serve as an introduction to the series. The title I have chosen for the subject is Why Indian Labor is Determined to Win This War. There is one fact which must arrest the attention of all. It relates to the attitude of Indian labor towards the war. In the midst of this sudden surge of non cooperation with and opposition to the war effort which we are witnessing in India, labor has been actively cooperating in the prosecution of the war. Of this, there can be no question. This labor has done and is determined to do, notwithstanding the many efforts that are being made to dissuade it from doing. What labor wants? During the war, labor has secured many gains.
As anybody has anything to say on this, or would like to offer their comments, because I think this is at the time of the war, and as the preface is clear, it's there was to be a series of talk on All India Radio, which will be deliberating on this particular topic, and Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar being the a member of the executive. He was the head of the executive council, which handled the labor department. So, it was natural for him to begin this series of talk. And I think the title itself is very provocative in a sense of why Indian labor is determined to win this war. So, it's talking about labor, and that too the labor which is Indian labor, and Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is talking on behalf of the labor which is determined to win the World War II. So this context, I think, is very important, that that was a time in India when there were several political parties that were not willing to side with the British war efforts, and they wanted to have the independence first, and they wanted not to take any position during the war, and therefore I think this position of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar merits some kind of a discussion as to why he chose to become a votary of the war efforts against the Nazism and fascism. And I think that's a very important point as to why Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has become a votary, or a strong, offered a strong position to the ideology of Nazism and fascism, because that will help us to draw parallelism between what's happening in the world today in different countries. So this paragraph itself sets a tone for the upcoming discussion, because here in this line, as Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar makes it clear, in the midst of this sudden surge of non-cooperation with and opposition to the war effort, which we are witnessing in India, labor has been actively cooperating in the prosecution of the war. Right?
Right. So I'll continue.
Yeah, please do.
What labor wants? During the war, labor has secured many gains and will no doubt secure many more. As pointed out by me recently, labor has obtained security through legislation. It has obtained the right to safety, care, and attention through the conditions of welfare which have been enforced by the central government upon the employers for the benefit of labor. But if labor is determined to do its utmost to accelerate the war effort, it is not simply because of the lure of these immediate gains. There are other and stronger reasons which are at the base of this determination. Labor is not content with the securing merely fair conditions of work. What labor wants is fair conditions of life. Let me explain what labor means by fair conditions of life.
Okay, I think this paragraph is very important, and we can begin to reflect on this very important paragraph as to, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is saying that during the war, labor has secured many gains and will no doubt secure many more. So he is not concerned about the labor reforms or the rights and gains that have been acquired by the labor in this country. And we know that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was the head and the founder of the Independent Labour Party, and he's speaking on the behalf of the labor and saying that there are many gains which have been achieved, but he's also talking about labor has obtained security through legislation, and he's saying that there is right to safety, care, and attention through the condition of welfare which have been enforced by the central government upon the employees for the benefits of the labor. I think these are very important points in this speech, which makes it clear to us that how we can understand the position of a labor in this particular situation. So so what is happening here is he's saying that labor is trying to now accelerate a position to oppose the war, and it's not for any immediate gain. So the labor doesn't want any immediate gains as far as the labor support for the war is concerned. And I think this is a very significant point which Babasaheb Ambedkar is making here, that there are other and stronger regions which are at the base of this determination. So, what are the strong base of recommendation that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is seeking here? So what labor wants is fair conditions of life. So now here, what is being talked about is not the fair conditions of work, which is the domain of the labor, but the fair conditions of life. And I think this is very important for us to bear in mind whenever we talk about in any policy making, what are the fair conditions of life. And this is a phrase, I think, which has got a potential to have a language to talk about, in all the domains of life. What are the fair conditions of life, not the fair conditions of work, isn't it? And Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar says that now he's going to make clear what are the fair conditions of life. And I think that's very important to understand. So anybody would like to say anything on this? Anybody has anything to offer? Is this line of thinking clear to those who are listening?
Yes, sir, very much clear.
Very good, very good, very good, very good. So in that case, we will proceed on to read further.
Sure. Labor means fair. Let me explain what labor means by fair conditions of life. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Labor wants liberty. This is perhaps nothing new in this. What is new is labor's conception of liberty. Labor's conception of liberty is not merely the negative conception of absence of restraint, nor is labor's conception of liberty confined to the mere recognition of the right of the people to vote. Labor's conception of liberty is very positive. It involves the idea of government by the people. Government by the people, in the opinion of labor, does not mean parliamentary democracy. Parliamentary democracy is a form of government in which the function of the people has to come to be to vote for their masters and leave them to rule. Such a scheme of government, in the opinion of Labour, is a travesty of government by the people. Labour wants government which is government by the people in name as well as in fact. Secondly, liberty as conceived by Labour includes the right to equal opportunity and the duty of the state to provide the fullest facilities for growth to every individual according to his needs.
So we will take a pause here because I think there is a lot here in this paragraph. Liberty, Labour wants liberty. And often there is a discussion on what constitutes the liberty. And, everybody talks about liberty. And I find this very interesting because Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar talks of liberty in negative terms and in positive terms. So in a way, he's talking about the negative liberty and the positive liberty. And it is said that, there was this great philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, who founded this the concept of two liberties. And, he has done it in 1958. But, if you look at this speech, which is given in the year 1943, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has been very meticulously trying to find the meaning of the word liberty. And it will be interesting for some scholars to look into as to how this conception of negative liberty and positive liberty has come into the intellectual history of the world, because it is generally attributed to Isaiah Berlin, who has talked about it in 1958. So let's look at it sentence by sentence, because we need to really now start, analyzing each sentence here. So Labour wants liberty. Everybody wants liberty. India wants liberty, because that's how, India is constituted, based on the value of liberty. And, what is being said here is, there is perhaps nothing new in this. What is new is Labour's conception of liberty. So what is the Labour's conception of liberty? And that's the point where Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has entered into, the Labour's conception of liberty. And according to him, the Labour's conception of liberty is not merely the negative conception of absence of restraints. You see, so, if somebody has to be free, they should be free from any constraint. So that is one conception of liberty. So here, absence of restraints, which means that there is no restraints on an individual to do what they want to do. And that's one way by which the liberty can be understood. And that's the negative conception of liberty, which is very important for all of us to understand that, we should not be constrained or restrained by any external agencies, cultures, societies, conventions, or whatever, that oppresses a human being. So here, the Labour is not talking about the negative liberty. Now, is Labour's conception of liberty is confined to the mere recognition of the right of the people to vote. So you see, then generally, the liberty is confined to the people's right to vote. And Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar says that, this is not the view of the Labour. So what is the Labour's conception of liberty? And according to Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, it's very positive, isn't it? And what is positive about it? So when he's talking about the positive liberty, he talks about the idea of government by the people. Government by the people, in the opinion of Labour, does not mean mere parliamentary democracy. That's a very important point that we have to bear in today's context, because, we loud about democracy in terms of having a parliamentary democracy. But we have to question now deeply as to what constitutes the democracy. What is the conception of the government which will ensure the positive liberty to the masses, to all the human beings? And I think by virtue of that line of thinking, it becomes imperative for us to think about this very important concept that Babasaheb Ambedkar is now here exploring in terms of surely government by the people, but in the opinion of the Labour does not mean parliamentary democracy. So what is a parliamentary democracy? As Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has spoken in the speech, parliamentary democracy is a form of government in which the function of the people has come to be to vote for their masters and leave them to rule. isn't it? And that's what is happening in the parliamentary democracy today. We vote after every 5 years in the elections, and then we forget. Such a scheme of government, in the opinion of Labour, is a travesty of government by the people. Labour wants government which is government by the people in name, as well as, in the name
as well as in fact.
Because I have to manage a lot of people joining the room, because I am also an administrator, because there was a spam attack on this Zoom meeting today. So let me make Nikhil administrator post. Okay. I don't know whether that would allow. Okay, let's carry on with whatever is happening. Okay. So here, what is needed is, as a positive conception of liberty as conceived by the Labour, includes the right to equal opportunity and the duty of the state to provide the fullest facilities for growth to every individual according to his needs. And I think that's where we have to concentrate on articulating the meaning of the democracy in terms of liberty that is there in the Constitution of India, which has come into existence after 7 years, when this speech was delivered by Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. So I found this speech very important in the context today to understand, what is liberty, what is the positive conception of liberty, what is the negative conception of liberty, and here what Babasaheb Ambedkar has given clearly is that the liberty as conceived by Labour includes the right to equal opportunity. So nobody talks about equal opportunity. Nobody talks about the duty of the state to provide the fullest facilities. Now, what we are talking about today is the public good and the government as some kind of a delivery agency of the public good. Nobody is talking about the real meaning of what is mean by the real democracy. And I think when Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar begins his discussion on liberty in terms of, the two conception, the negative liberty and positive liberty. And when he is talking about the positive liberty in terms of the government by the people, and then he is expanding on it as to what he meant by the government by the people, which does not mean parliamentary democracy, because that's what we mean today. So parliamentary democracy is just a form of government in which the function of the people has come to be to vote for their masters and leave them to rule. Such a scheme of government, in the opinion of Labour, is a travesty of the government by the people. So true today, isn't it? So what do we want? We want liberty in terms of the right to equal opportunity, and the state is duty bound to provide the fullest facilities and for the growth of every individual according to his needs. So I think that's very important paragraph here. So anybody would like to comment or reflect on these two paragraphs here?
When Babasaheb talks about providing fullest facilities for growth to every individual according to his needs, is this about skill development? This is more...
When we are talking about the fullest facilities, we are talking about all the dimensions that constitute an individual. Okay, because he's talking about an individual. He's talking about an individual human being as a unit. So it is not just limited to what is called the livelihood or the skills. It's one of the many aspects where the fullest growth of the individual is possible. So for example, even dignity, to ensure dignity is a very important way to facilitate the full growth of an individual.
Right.
Even if you provide them the skills or livelihood or an employment, but if you are denying them the dignity of labor, then we are denying them the full facilities by which they can grow, isn't it? So fullest facilities for growth is a very to use a word, holistic term. It is not just about employment. It is not just about health. It's not just about all the things that are being talked about. It's also about the psychological development of the individual. It's also about the material growth of the individual, so that they can be free from the wants and hunger.
I'm just reminded we had a 1098 child helpline for harassment, which is currently stopped funding by the central government, which leads to a lot more cases of harassment and abuse, which cannot be supported by the government anymore. So maybe those are also aspects.
Yes. So that's a very good point. So whenever we are talking about the fullest facilities for growth to every individual, every word here is of a paramount importance. If we understand how Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is now articulating his position about positive liberty. So anything to offer, any comments, any critical reflection by anybody before we proceed on to move the next paragraph?
A basic doubt, Mangeshji. Why does he say labor and not laborers?
Because, that is a category in terms of, in terms of how, this
is it the class, like labor class?
It's a class which is inclusive of all the oppressed people.
Right.
Isn't it? That is the original conception of labor, which Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, took on. And labor included all the, toiling classes in the country.
Right.
That means he's talking about the majority of the population. Even today, if we look at the labor in terms of these, both organized or unorganized, that's one category. But labor in terms of the people who actually do the work, isn't it?
So the working class is the labor class.
Working class.
Yeah.
Yes. And much more than that. Even the scheduled caste can be included there. The scheduled tribes can be included there, and so on and so forth. So labor also includes the submerged classes.
Which is potential labor, which may not be provided labor, but they are potential labor.
Yes. We understand here the word labor in terms of the political party or the ideology that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar represented in terms of the Independent Labour Party. Okay. And he was invited to join the Viceroy Executive Council as the leader of the labor. And there has been very less studies, about the contribution of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar in the labor movement. And if you look at this, Independent Labour Party came out in 1937, the first general elections of India. And that was also the time when the Labour Party was just formed and came to power, even in England. So, Ramsay MacDonald, 1932, and, he was the first Labour Prime Minister who has, become the Prime Minister of the UK. And that was a train to work the government in a way that will help the toiling masses, that will help the toiling classes of the country. So we'll touch upon those points as we go on. Okay?
Yeah.
Sure. I'll continue reading.
Yeah, please.
Labor wants equality. By equality, labor means abolition of privileges of every kind in law, in the civil service, in the army, in taxation, in trade, and in industry. In fact, the abolition of all processes which lead to inequality.
We'll take a pause here, because this 4 lines, isn't it, captures the very essence of what constitutes equality, isn't it? And while we are reading the speech of 1943, we also visualize what's happening in our country today in terms of equality. So what how meticulously he has forged every single word here. By equality, labor means abolition of privileges of every kind. Okay. So there should not be any privileged class in the country. Now, when he is saying that, abolition of privileges of every kind, he's qualifying. So how does he qualify? In law, there should not be any privileged class. In the civil services, there should not be any privileged class. In the army, in taxation, in trade, and in industry. And he's summarizing his conception of equality in the last sentence as, in fact, the abolition of all processes which lead to inequality. Now you just keep this foundational definition of equality in your mind and begin to look at, the context today as to what's happening. Is there a privileged class in law? And we know the answer. In the civil services, is there a privileged class? We know the answer. In the army, Indian army, in taxation, who are privileged? Isn't it? In trade and in industry. Are we trying to abolish all the processes which lead to inequality? These are the big questions. And they are not rhetorical questions. They are the real questions that we have to think about when we are thinking about equality. So anything on that?
So, sir, in such a case, how do we bring the labor on an equal footing?
Yeah, so that is what is important here, because, in this context, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar goes on further in talking about the various means by which it can be, it can be had. And, as we read further, we will be begin to, understand a lot of things here. Is that okay, Suraj?
Yes, sir, so we can explore further.
Yeah. Anybody
else? Almost as if Babasaheb predicted what would happen if any fascist tendencies overtake a democratic setup.
Yeah. That's true. That is true. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let's read.
Labor wants fraternity. By fraternity, it means an all-pervading sense of human brotherhood, unifying all classes and all nations, with peace on earth and goodwill towards man as its motto.
Okay, we will also reflect on this. Okay, anybody would like to reflect on this? Advocate Saab?
If we read that previous line, then Supreme Court has a lot of job to do. All the courts which are there right now been introduced from 2014 till date. There's a lot of job for Supreme Court to see whether they are according to Article 14, 15, Article 17 and so on. Article 21. For example, there is a law, legislation, which talks about Gram Nyaya Act. This Gram Nyaya Act says that if there is a civil cases pending for more than 10 years, then, and if it is been resolved through arbitration by this Gram Nyaya, then there is no further appeal, right? And in that Gram Nyaya Act, they have included legislation like Protection of Civil Rights Act, which flows from Article 70. Now, Article 70 is a fundamental right. Article 32 says that if there is a violation of fundamental right, then you can tap the doors of Supreme Court. And legislation Gram Nyaya Act says that you can't appeal even to district court.
So this is the travesty of justice.
Yeah. So abolition of all processes which lead to inequality. The processes defined by the legislations or the rules in all those legislations are against what Babasaheb is saying.
So very, very
It's
important.
huge work.
Yes. So very important point.
There are many laws. I mean, the new labor codes which are now being defined. If we see what Babasaheb is talking about on uh, the fullest facilities for growth to every individual according to his needs. So even whatever there was in earlier compensation act in the industrial compensation act or workman force act, all those has been now reduced down or all have been curtailed. So even in that sense, the new labor code which are there, which were introduced, are against the ethos and sort of with ideas and wisdom what Babasaheb is narrating in this paragraph.
Yes. That's perfectly worded. How about this labor wants fraternity and definition of fraternity? It means all pervading sense of human brotherhood. What of that? Unifying all classes and all nations with peace on earth and goodwill towards man as its motto. See the way Babasaheb Ambedkar, clarifies everything step by step is a lesson in how we should be articulating the ideas. Just to digress a bit, we have been hearing about all the time liberty, equality, and fraternity, and in terms of various concepts. But you see the way Babasaheb Ambedkar comes to define liberty in terms of positive and negative conception of liberty. And then he talks about, very important aspect of the government, which is not just the right to vote or vote for somebody who will be your master. It's much more deeper than that. And, the similar is the concept of equality. Nowhere you are going to find such a clearly worded definition of what constitutes equality in terms of its pragmatic, conception. And the similar is the case with fraternity. So you see all this conceptualization, all this articulation of ideas is very important because these days what we find is people use such kind of words in terms of the slogans, but Babasaheb Ambedkar is talking about not the fair conditions of work. He's talking about these are the fair conditions of life. Without liberty, equality, and fraternity, there cannot be a fair, there cannot be a human life. Forget, the political things behind it. There is not a possibility of a human life. These are the fair conditions by which the human life is made what it is, the human life. Okay, go on reading because I think there is a lot which we are going to explore today.
That's very important. What he's talking about there, even he included taxation.
Yeah.
Now, even if you take taxation for that matter in India, the indirect taxes are more than 65%. Right? That's a huge burden.
Yeah.
If we say ourselves to be a progressive, in progressive countries there are more direct taxes and indirect taxes are less. Whereas the general mass is giving more taxation through the indirect taxes.
Yeah.
And so the processes which are laid down for even for a simple thing, right? Say the collection of GST itself. How, and if you see, if we try to expand the horizon of equality to this, what he is talking, Babasaheb is talking about, of all processes which lead to inequality. You can imagine how we are in unequal society.
Yes.
Not only what we see through the caste prism, but the parameters of development and indicator itself. Right to education. You are claiming it to be a school where there are only 2 rooms, only one single person, one single teacher, right? I mean, on one hand, you are saying it's right to education, but you are classifying that education to to give privileges to some. You have central school, central Vidyalaya, Kendriya Vidyalaya, where our government employees can send their children, where they have play school, where they have laboratory and enough number of teachers. On other hand, you are naming that two rooms as a school where there is only one single teacher,
Right.
right? And that too, he is also doing other sort of work.
Yes.
So if we try to involve, I mean, see, if we try to apply these processes or apply this definition, the huge inequality in every aspect.
Yes. Right. Yes. So I think we will read on further because there is a lot to cover and comment on. So please go on. And while we read, you keep on the current situation of India in your mind.
Sure. So we have read about the labor bonds fraternity. Now the next is the Nazi New Order. These are labor's ideals. They constitute the new order, the establishment of which alone can save humanity from destruction. How can this new order be established if the allied nations lose the war? That is the supreme question which labor knows it would be fatal to shirk or to avoid. Can this new order be established by sitting idle and refusing to fight? Labor believes that victory for the allied nations is the only hope of such a new order coming into being. If the allies fail, sure enough, there will be a new order, but the new order will be no other than the Nazi order. It will be an order in which liberty will be found to be suppressed, equality denied, and fraternity expurgated as a pernicious doctrine. This is by no means the whole of the Nazi New Order. There are parts of the Nazi order which must compel every Indian to give anxious thought to its dangers, no matter what his religion, his caste, and his political faith. The most important part is the one which enunciates the creed of racial gradation. This is the principal dictum in the Nazi order. The Nazis regard the German race as the race of Superman. They are pleased to place the other wild races below the German race. But to the brown races and Indians are included in this category, they give the last place in the gradation. As though this is not humiliating enough, the Nazis have declared that the brown races shall be the serfs of the German and the white races. They are not to have education, they are not to have any liberty, political or economic.
So when I am, talking about why this speech is so important, because you can literally identify everything that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has mentioned here. Matches with whatever the circumstances we are finding ourselves today, and so the ideals of for the labor that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is talking about as the fair conditions of life, liberty, equality, and fraternity. He is defining that, and he's saying that this is how the new order will be created in the world, in the society, and this is the only way. The new order based on the liberty, equality, and fraternity is the only way alone can save humanity from destruction. And how can this new order be established if the allied nations lose the war? So there were Axis nations, like on one hand Germany, Italy, and Japan. On the other hand, there were the allied nation. And Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is now taking the argument further that this is what are the bedrock of the new order that has to come in the world to save the humanity. He's talking about a very broader question of the humanity. And in that, he's placing that if the allied nations lose the war, what will be the new order? So the new order will be, of course, based on what is called the Nazi order. And the Nazi order, when he's talking about the Nazi order, he's using a very beautiful phraseologies to formulate, his ideas. You see, this last sentence in the first paragraph that we are reading, it will be an order in which liberty will be found to be suppressed. So what you do with the liberty, you always try to suppress the liberty. These words are very important, even prophetic. So whenever you want to trample down on the humanity, the first thing that you do is suppress the liberty and you deny equality, isn't it? And the fraternity is said to be a pernicious doctrine. He says, the Nazi, or for that example, for that matter, the Hindutva ideology says that some people are not qualified to be their brothers. That's what the caste system is all about. And when Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar goes on to describe what is the Nazi new order or the Nazi social order, the Nazi social order was nothing but the racial gradation. It's just like what Babasaheb Ambedkar talks about the gradation of the society in terms of the various castes, isn't it? And Hitler's aim was to institute the global racial order, the global caste system in which, the only the German race will be at the top of it and the other races will be servile to that. And, there is a kind of an irony when we are looking at this sentence, because in India, Hitler is lauded by a lot of people. And according to the Hitler, the brown race or the Indians are so inferior a race that you should, their only work is to serve the German race and the white race, isn't it? They are much below that, isn't it? Even then, we find so much of a praise for Hitler in a lot of ideological circles of India. So the point here is, we do not understand what is happening. And if you look at what was happening in the Nazi Germany or the fascist Italy in terms of the suppression of liberty, denial of equality, and treating the fraternity as a pernicious doctrine, the same things are happening today in a lot of countries, including in our own country. And therefore, I think this is very important for us to understand that racial gradation. If we want to identify a Nazi, how do we identify a Nazi? They talk about some kind of a gradation or supremacy of a class. They talk about inequality. They say that people are not equal. They get what they deserve, and fraternity is not their cup of tea anytime, because they want a fractured society. So I think the way Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has formulated and conceptualized this very important speech that echoes with our time today needs a far deeper reading by the people who wants to fight the Nazism. And I think the most important question is, if we want to create a new order based on liberty, equality, and fraternity, can it be established by sitting idle and refusing to fight? It's a very important question. Can we refuse not to fight and sit idle if we want to create something new? Very important questions that Babasaheb Ambedkar has raised here, and we need to look into that as to, can we afford to sit idle and refuse to fight? So anybody has anything to, offer as a way of comments, as a way of, bringing more clarity to what we are discussing?
In the last sentence, what he wrote, they are not to have education. And the only other thing which he took over there in that sentence, liberty, political or economic. Now, if you try to see in terms of development paradigm, education is one factor and there are other factors as well, right? But he has only chosen education over there. Certainly, he has a lot to say on education, but if we see in our country today, we have a new normal. The hatred and the way lynchings are being done, right? Now, it's also visible in a state like Maharashtra, in Mumbai as well. Day before yesterday, there was 2 days back there was an incident. But in this new normal, people have started responding in a new way, and I think even that response is also not helpful to us. Uh, Say for example, again I will come back to education because he has mentioned over there. With respect to the municipal corporation education in many cities uh, in Maharashtra, many NGOs are coming and trying to offer a help in uh, sort of language, English speaking, and so on and so forth. In Pimpri-Chinchwad in Pune, 15 schools of municipal corporation handed over to an NGO named Akanksha, right? And these schools, they entered just to facilitate with the language so that students participating in the municipal school were able to speak in English, write in English, read in English. Now they are sort of governing and managing the entire 15 schools. Earlier, for these 15 schools, municipal corporation used to budget and provide assistance. Now there is no budgetary provision and there is no recruitment for these 15 schools. So NGOs are managing these schools with 5,000 or 10,000 rupees volunteering.
Right.
And this 15 school, which might have offered jobs to at least 30 different staff, 30 or 40 teachers, there might be a reservation in recruiting those teachers. Now they are not, right? So it's so the response which is being given by the so-called civil society is also we need to check. People are responding to the situation, whatever we are having in India today. Yes, the Hindutva, Hindu nationalism is growing. They are on their way to declare this country as a Hindu nation. But the response which are being created or given by the political parties to the narratives of Hindu nationalism, that needs to be also seen. Right? On one hand, they are saying no, the education policy will offer something very different. But whatever civil society is responding, that is also not favorable to the people of this country, particularly scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and other nomadic tribes, those who participate more through municipal education. And if you take the case of Pune, around 65% scheduled caste are enrolling themselves in municipal education, right? To the school of municipal education. So, so the response which is also given in order to, I mean, that also need to be seen.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So anything on this? I think we should go on reading further.
Sure, sir. A direct menace. The fury with which the British government has been denounced by Hitler in his Mein Kampf for having given Indians education and political liberty is quite well known. The Nazi ideology is a direct menace to the liberty and freedom of Indians. Given this fact, there is the strongest reason why Indians should come forward to light Nazism. No one who compares the Nazi order with the new order which Labour has in view can have any doubt that Labour, in making up its determination to fight for the Allies and to defeat and destroy Nazism, has taken up a position which is the only position which all sensible people can take. There are, however, people who refuse to take this view.
Go on.
There are some who think that they do not mind a Nazi victory and the coming of the new Nazi order. Fortunately, not many of these are to be found in the country. Those who take this view are not serious themselves. Nobody takes them seriously. They are embittered politicians who will not be satisfied unless they are allowed to dictate their way and whose motto is all or nothing. There are pacifists who argue that all wars are wrong. They argue that the troubles of the world are largely due to the wars that have devastated and defaced human civilization, which men have built up at the cost of so much human effort. This is true, but in spite of all this, labor refuses to accept pacifism as a principle of life. Wars cannot be abolished by merely refusing to fight when attacked. People obtained by surrender to the forces of violence is not peace. It is an act of suicide for which it is difficult to find any justification. It is a sacrifice of all that is noble and necessary for maintaining a worthy human life to the forces of savagery and barbarism. Surrender is not labor's way to abolish war. Only two things will, in the opinion of labor, abolish war. One is to win the war and other is to establish a just peace. In the view of labor, both are equally important. Labor holds that the origin of war does not lie in man's thirst for blood. The origin of war is to be found in the vile peace that victors often impose upon the vanquished. According to labor, the duty of the pacifist is not to sulk and to refuse to fight when war is on. Labor believes that the duty of the pacifist is to be active and alert both when war is on and also when the terms of peace are being forged. The pacifist fails to do the right thing at the right time. The pacifists are active against war when war is on. They are inactive and indifferent when the war is over and peace is being made. In this way, pacifists lose both war as well as peace. If labor proposes to fight this war, it is because pacifism is not the labor's way of abolishing war.
I think the undergoing discussion under a direct minutes, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is making some very, very important points that needs a lot of reflection and, understanding, because he's talking about a situation where people, he's not naming the Indian politicians of the time who were, so adamant to go for, everything or nothing. They were not trying to forge a middle ground so that, they can find a way through. They were hell-bent on only the extreme positions, or all or nothing. And I think this is a very interesting thing that has been brought up here in terms of in our own ways. When we are fighting something, we cannot take the extreme position of all or nothing. We have to be find a negotiating position all the time. And that way, all or nothing, it doesn't work. And I think this paragraph itself is very, very important for us to understand, to have a lessons in how we should be going ahead. But the most important thing is, the pacifism that has been often talked about. And Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, one of the greatest exponent of non-violence, was not a pacifist in a sense of, just opposing the war. And he's making a case here, which is very important, that, when there is a savage forces of savagery and barbarism, you cannot accept it. We have to fight. And this fighting is not just for winning the war. It is also for establishing the just peace. And when I read about this phrase, just peace, for the first time, it's such an amazing sort of a concept that, we talk about peace. And elsewhere, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar makes it a point, a difference between the animal peace and the just peace, isn't it? If the people, human beings, are living in a pacified life on a very sub level of consciousness, almost living instinctual, or not to debase the animals, but on the animal level, not using their full potential, that peace is of no consequence. And what kind of a peace we need in the world today? We need just peace. Without justice, if we elaborate, without justice, there cannot be peace. So all the talk of peace without a talk of justice are futile and fruitless. And that's what Babasaheb Ambedkar is making a very important point, that, we cannot afford, of course, we should stop the wars in the world, because, it destroys, as Babasaheb Ambedkar says, that the force destroys the very, very object for which the force is applied. And he goes on further that we cannot just surrender to the forces of violence. And he defines peace. Peace obtained by surrender to the forces of violence is not peace, isn't it? So at the same time, he's making peace, not something coisoned. He's going deep into his conception of peace. He's making, in a way, peace a very dynamic sort of a process in the world, where we stop the forces of savagery and barbarism. If we don't do anything about the forces of savagery and barbarism, we are committing the societal suicide, isn't it? So, we have to fight. And how do we fight? We just don't fight for winning certain conflict. But aftermath of that, what is after that? Isn't it? What is the motto of fighting a war? Is it just to win over some argument, or is it to establish some kind of a harmony between the people? And I think this is very important, because most of the times people talk about, ending the conflict, but what happens after the conflict is finished? Do we have the vision of that? And I think that's why this particular articulation of Babasaheb Ambedkar is so important. It's so important, even today's context. It's so important. We cannot afford to be a pacifist. We have to fight. We have to fight for the justice and peace. Without justice, there cannot be peace. So any comments, anything?
So I just want to repeat this line that surrender is not labor's way to abolish war. Only two things will, in the opinion of labor, abolish war. One is to win the war, and the other is to establish a just peace. In the view of labor, both are equally important.
So if there is no justice, there will be always a war. If there is no equality, there will be always a war. If there is no liberty, there will always be a war. There will not be a fair condition for life. Those conditions will be unfair to life, right? And whatever is unfair, leads to war. So war, is not about, a thirst for blood. It's about, origin of war is to be found in the wild peace that victors often impose upon the vanquished. Very, very important, conception of Babasaheb Ambedkar as to how the conflict comes into being. Right? So should we go on further reading if there is no any reflection or any comments by anybody? All right, Nikhil, go on.
French Revolution record. There are pessimists who say that there is no guarantee that victory will be followed by a new order. There is perhaps room for this pessimism. The new order, which is ideal of labor, has its roots in the French Revolution. The French Revolution gave rise to two principles, the principle of self-government and the principle of self-determination. The principal rule of self-government expresses the desire of the people to rule itself rather than be ruled by others, whether the rulers be absolute monarchs, dictators, or privileged classes. It is called democracy. The principle of self-determination expresses the desire of a people united by common ideals and common purposes to decide without external compulsion its political status, whether independence, interdependence, or union with other peoples of the world. This is called nationalism. The hope of humanity was centered on the fructification of these principles. Unfortunately, after a lapse of nearly 140 years, these principles have failed to take root. The old regime has continued either in all its nakedness or by making sham concessions to these two principles. Barring a few countries, there was neither self-government nor self-determination in the world. All this, of course, is true, but this is no argument against the attitude taken by labor, namely, that the preliminary condition for the establishment of the new order is victory over the forces of Nazism. All that this means is that labor must be more vigilant and that the war must not stop with victory over Nazis, but there must be no peace unless there is victory over the old order wherever it is found.
Okay. So you see, often we are talking about how the concept of democracy and nationalism came. And, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar traces the root of that in the French Revolution here. And it looks like a very small 2 paragraphs, but, they encapsulate the history of the modern world or the nations that we see there in today's world. And, he's saying that the French Revolution has given rise to 2 principles, and the principle of self-government and the principle of self-determination. And he goes on defining them. And he says that, the masses have chosen not to be ruled by the monarchs, dictators, or privileged classes. They wanted the rule of the demos or the people. And the second principle was that, they will have a common ideal by which they will determine their destiny. They will determine their goals of life without any external compulsion. And their political status, whether it's independence or interdependence or union with the people of the world, will be determined by the people, by that group of people who are mobilized by certain common ideals and common purposes to decide. And the hope of the humanity was centered on this. But we know what has happened after 140 years. Now after 200 years, we know what has happened to nationalism, how nationalism has been used in a way that suppresses the very citizens of that country. So you see, with a very clear and very categorical analysis, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has brought up this very interesting sort of the history, the political history of the world of the last 200 years, which is even still relevant today. So he says that this is true, this is what is happening, that there is neither self-government nor self-determination in the world, but that is not an excuse not to fight against the Nazis, because he says that the victory over Nazis is very important, and there will not be a possibility of peace if the Nazi order or the Nazism wins the war, World War II. So that's how Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has talked about the political history of the last 140 years now, 200 years of how the nation states came into being, the fact of the principles of self-government and the self-determination leading to nationalism. So any comments on this, or should we go on further? Okay, we can go on.
Labor and nationalism. More serious opponents of labor are, of course, the nationalists. They accuse labor of taking an attitude which is said to be inconsistent with and injurious to Indian nationalism. Their second objection is that labor agrees to fight for the war without getting any assurances about India's independence. These are questions so often posed and so seriously argued that it is necessary to state what labor thinks of them. As to nationalism, labor's attitude is quite clear. Labor is not prepared to make a fetish of nationalism. If nationalism means the worship of the ancient past, the discarding of everything that is not local in origin and color, then labor cannot accept nationalism as its creed. Labor cannot allow the living faith of the dead to become the dead faith of the living. Labor will not allow the ever expanding spirit of man to be strangled by the hand of the past, which has no meaning for the present and no hope for the future. Nor will it allow it to be crammed in a narrow jacket of local particularism. Labor must constantly insist upon renovating the life of the people by being ever ready to borrow in order to repair, transform, and recreate the body politic. If nationalism stands in the way of rebuilding and reshaping of life, then labor must deny nationalism. Labor's creed is internationalism. Labor is interested in nationalism only because the wheels of democracy, such as representative parliaments, responsible executive, constitutional conventions, etc., work better in a community united by national sentiments. Nationalism to labor is only a means to an end. It is not an end in itself to which labor can agree to sacrifice what it regards as the most essential principles of life.
Okay, I think this particular section of the speech it captures everything that that we have all understand very clearly, because there is always a talk about nationalism, and you see Dr. Babasaheb is a very very particular about choosing the phrases, and he's saying that labor is not prepared to make a fetish of nationalism. Very powerful phrase that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has used here, because sometimes in the name of nationalism, as we see, people's emotions are moved against a particular community or a particular group of people. And you see this, we do not have to have a fetish of nationalism, because, and he goes on defining, the kind of nationalism which has been sold to the masses. And that is so true today, even when we are looking at what is happening around us. So, for example, he says that if nationalism means the worship of the ancient past, isn't it? That, our nation was great, there was a golden Vedic age or whatever, kind of, worshipping of the past. Our nation was great 1,000 years ago, and, we were ruined by these people, that people, this all, is not acceptable, because, he goes on clarifying the discarding of everything that is not local in origin and color, you see. So emphasizing on only local thing, how great we were, how great is our culture, how spiritual we are, and so on and so forth, and discarding everything which is not local in origin. And then labor cannot accept nationalism as its creed. We cannot accept nationalism like that. In a nutshell, we cannot accept any form or a fetish of nationalism which talks about the past or glorifies the past and talks about particular localism or local particularism. That is not acceptable. Why? Because labor cannot allow the living faith of the dead. You see, very meticulous. In the rhetorical language, it's called chiasmus, X. One sentence and then we invert it. You see, labor cannot allow the living faith of the dead to become the dead faith of the living, isn't it? So some faith of the dead, living faith of the dead, might be useful then, it is not at all useful today. So it cannot become the dead faith of living, and that's what is happening. The whole society is being talked about the past, what happened here, where was the temple, where was the masjid, and so on and so forth. Nobody's talking about what is the real spirit of human beings. So labor will not allow. You see, this is very prophetic. Labor will not allow the ever expanding spirit of man to be strangled by the hand of the past, which has no meaning for the present and no hope for the future. Nor will it allow it to be cramped in a narrow jacket of local particularism. Labor must constantly insist upon renovating the life of the people. You see, the renovation of the life of the people, the newness of in the life of the people, in the life of the nation is so important. And we should be ready to borrow. So we should not be shy of borrowing from any source in order to repair, transform, and recreate the body politic. You see, what a formulation of a vision that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has given for a nation to be. If nationalism stand in the way of this rebuilding and reshaping of life, so what is important in Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar conception of the things is the rebuilding and reshaping of the life. And if nationalism even is stopping the life to rebuild, reshape, and transform or repair, then we have nothing to do with this nationalism. And what is the creed of the labor? Internationalism, globalism, cosmopolitanism. Why we are interested in nationalism is only because it is good for the wheels of democracy, because the democracy works in the national context where there is a national sentiment, nothing else. Nationalism, we want nationalism only for the sake of rotating the wheels of democracy. Very clear articulation of how we can rotate the wheels of the democracy through the representative parliament, responsible executive, constitutional conventions, because they work better in a community united by national sentiments. That is what we need. So nationalism is only a means to an end. It is not an end. And the most important thing are the essential principles of life. And we should be ready to sacrifice everything to ensure that the essential principles of life are protected. Right? Anything on this?
I wanted to reflect on this. So Babasaheb clearly tells that nationalism to labor is just a means, but it is not the end. We need to think beyond that. This is nationalism is somewhat essential when we want all the bodies, that is representative parliaments, executive, and all to work together in a collaborative manner. So for that, the sentiment of nationalism can be used, but it is not the end. You should not just restrict yourself that you will just use local, for example, local goods. You should also seek help if that is for your betterment, and not you can say shy away from that on the context of being nationalistic in it. So you should always see and crave for innovation. So that is also being highlighted in the speech.
Yes. Anyone? If not, then we will move on further. Nikhil, can you read further?
Sure. So we have last three topics in this speech. We'll accordingly wind up. Independence, a wrong approach. As to independence, labor fully recognizes its importance, but labor thinks that there is a wrong approach to the question of independence and a misunderstanding about its importance. The independence of a nation X hypothesis does not tie it up to any particular form of government or organization of society. External independence is quite compatible with internal slavery. Independence means nothing more than that a nation has liberty to determine its form of government and its social order without dictation from outside. The worth of independence depends upon the kind of government and the kind of society that is built up. There is not much value in independence if the form of government and the order of society are to be those against which the world is fighting today. Labour thinks that more emphasis ought to have been placed on New India and less than on Quit India. The appeal of a new India with a new order is bound to be greater than the appeal of independence. Indeed, the vision of a new order in a new India would very greatly strengthen determination to win freedom. Such an approach would certainly have stopped the many embarrassing questions which are being asked, namely freedom for what and freedom for whom. Secondly, immediate realization of independence as a condition for support to the war effort. Labour find it difficult to understand. This condition marks a sudden development in the attitude of some people to the war effort and could be justified only if there was any sudden conspiracy to rob India of a right to freedom. But there is no evidence of any such conspiracy, nor can such conspiracy, if there were any, succeed no matter who the conspirators are. In the view of Labour, no one can deprive India of her right to freedom if she demands it with the combined strength of united people. If India's independence is in the balance, it is because of disunity among Indians. The enemies of India's independence are Indians and no others.
Okay, I think there are some important points which Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has made here, that external independence is quite compatible with internal slavery. And when he talks about independence, he talks about independence in a very important way, that the independent has to do with the form of the government and the kind of the society that is to be built up. And if we have the independence but the form of the government or the order of the society does not change, what is the use of removing the external dependence? And he talks about we should talk about new India and new order, and we can expand it further. New social order, not Brahminical social order, not the caste-based social order, not the social order based on the supremacy of a few classes. So this is very important for us to understand, that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar says that he has not raised the difficult questions like freedom for what? Why do we want freedom? Just to have a transfer of power from one dominant group to another dominant group in that particular region? Or freedom from for whom? Freedom for whom? Freedom of what? Of the land or the people? This is the question that Babasaheb Ambedkar always raised. Freedom of land or the freedom of people? And then he talks about the life, the right of self, to choose the form of the government, and the form of the society entirely lies on the people who are living in the country. It has nothing to do with the external things. So he says that the enemies of India's independence are Indians and no others. That's true even today. Who are the enemies of the people? Isn't it? A citizen is poised against another citizen. A citizen is fighting another citizen. Isn't it? An Indian is fighting another Indian. Forgetting that they are Indian first and Indian last. People are placing their religious identities, their caste identity ahead of the identity of being an Indian. And in this context, we can see Babasaheb's statement, Indian first and Indian last, because that sentiment of common unity can rotate the wheel of democracy. If not, then what is the use of nationalism? Isn't it? So I think this is a very important paragraph. The whole speech is so important, needs a lot of reading, rethinking. So if there is anything, please comment, reflect. If not, we will move on. Okay, Nikhil, kindly go on.
Labor and war. Just a second. Labor's attitude to this war is framed after a full realization of what is involved in the war. Labor is aware that it must win the war as well as peace if war is to be banished from the world. Labor is aware that it is not enough to defeat the Nazis and to destroy the possibilities of the new Nazi order. It is not a war for the old order. It is a war on both the old order and the Nazi order. Labour is aware that the only compensation for the cost of this war is the establishment of a new order in which liberty, equality, and fraternity, which will not be mere slogans but will become facts of life. But the question of all questions is how can the hope of this new order materialize? On the question, Labour is quite empathetic. Labour insists that for the materialization of all these ideals, there is one condition that is primary, and that is success in the war. Without success in the war, there can be no self-government and self-determination for India. Without victory in the war, independence will be idle twaddle. This is the reason why Labour is determined to win this war.
Yeah, it's very self-explanatory, right?
Right.
So we go on further.
Sure. So two features of present war. This war is full of potentialities for good. It promises to give birth to a new order. Labour finds this war is different from the other wars. There are two features which distinguish it from other wars. In the first place, this war is not altogether a war for the division of the world's territory amongst the most powerful nations of the world. as the preceding wars have been. In this war, the division of the world's territory is not the only cause. This is a war in which there is a conflict of ideologies relating to the forms and systems of government under which humanity is to live. In the second place, this war is not altogether a mere war as other wars have been. Its object is not merely to defeat the enemy, to march on to his capital and to dictate a peace. This war, besides being a war, is also a revolution which demands a fundamental change in the terms of associated life, a replanning of the society. In this sense, it is a people's war, and if it is not, it could and should be made into a people's war.
Yes, go on.
Given these facts, Labour cannot be indifferent to this war and to its outcome. Labour is aware how the efforts in the past for the establishment of a new order have been frustrated time and again. This is because democracy, after it was brought into being, was left in Tory hand. If the people of the world take care to see that this mistake is not committed again in future, Labour believes that by fighting this war and establishing the new order, the world can be made safe for democracy.
This is a very important sort of discussion on the potentialities for good, because he goes on describing the very background of the World War II. There was, of course, people were fighting for the territories, but also there people were fighting for, the governments were fighting for, establishing the forms and the system of government. And we know that if the Nazism has taken over the world, the whole values of liberty, equality, and fraternity would have been jeopardized, and the fairness in the life would have gone. And therefore, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar talks about, the purpose of the war is not just to defeat the enemy, but this war can be termed as a revolution. And what is this revolution that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is talking about? A revolution which demands a fundamental change in the terms of associated life. So how human beings associate with each other, whether on the basis of gradation, whether on the basis of the caste system or communalism, or on the basis of liberty, equality, and fraternity. This is how he created a kind of a template to understand the war between the democracy and fascism and Nazism. And he says that it has to be looked as a revolution. And if we look at this World War II in terms of the revolution, he says that it has to be made into people's war, common man's war against the forces which are trying to undermine the very vitals of humanity itself. And he says that if it is not, it should be made the people's war. Isn't it? Every human being should fight for liberty, equality, and fraternity, enlarging the scope of a revolution. Isn't it? Fighting for liberty, equality, and fraternity, not just being pacifist in a sense that has been there and sold in a very glamorous way, the pacifism in the world today. And the kind of revolution that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is talking here is not just related to the war, or World War I or World War II. It is about people's war for their dignity, for their liberty, for their equality, for their fraternity. And he says that, the world has been frustrated because, after revolutions, nothing has happened. Why it has not happened? Because the government was taken over by the conservative governments, Tories. Like in India, the RSS and BJP, they are the conservative parties, lauding the past, invoking the glory of the past which never existed, and so on and so forth. Localism dripped into the particular sort of the customs, particular way of being, particular way of life, instead of universalizing what it is all about to be a human being. So this is a very important comments. These are the very important insights that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has offered us. Anything? Anything by anybody there?
Irony was that Hitler used that term, people's car, people's war.
In his own country's context.
To exist. Volkswagen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just like what's happening in India today. In the name of people, so many things are being done. Okay.
Okay. So I'll read further. Correct leadership. So that is the last part of this speech. The country needs a lead, and the question is who can give this lead? I venture to say that Labour is capable of giving to the country the lead it needs. Correct leadership, apart from other things, require idealism and free thought. Idealism is possible for the aristocracy, though free thought is not. Idealism and free thought are both possible for Labour, but neither idealism nor free thought is possible for the middle class. The middle class does not possess the liberty of the aristocracy, which is necessary to welcome and nourish an ideal. It does not possess the hunger for the new order, which is the hope on which the laboring classes live. Labor, therefore, has a very distinct contribution to make in bringing about a return to the sane and safe way of the past, which Indians had been pursuing to reach their political destiny. Labor's lead to India and Indians is to get into a fight and be united. The fruits of victory will be independence and a new social order. For such a victory, all must fight. Then the fruits of victory will be the patrimony of all, and there will be none to deny the rights of a united India to share in that patrimony. The end.
Okay, this small paragraph has many meanings, isn't it? It has so many meanings that what is the leadership? And you see, Dr. Babasaheb says that the labor, or if we map it today, the followers of Dr. Babasaheb or the exploited class or the submerged classes in this country, they are capable of providing the lead to this country. This is not an idealism. This is what is there, that this is what can happen. Who is capable of giving a leadership? So, Babasaheb says that the correct leadership needs idealism and free thought, isn't it? So idealism and free thought are possible in the aristocracy, because aristocrats, by their economic well-being, they have all the resources to think about ideas, think about, this is what has happened in the history of the world. The so-called aristocrats have been in the forefront to philosophize, envision the new social order, philosophize new ideas, and so on and so forth. So that is what is needed. Idealism is possible for aristocracy, and that's what has happened in the history of the world. This is what has happened in France. The aristocracy was in the forefront to generate new ideas in their salons, and you talk about all the ideas that you even talk today. But they cannot be free because they have vested interest. So they can have idealism, but they cannot have free thought. And ideas and free thought are both possible for labor because it has nothing to lose, isn't it? So it has both the possibilities, but neither idealism nor free thought is possible for middle class. This is a very thought-provoking statement that we need to think about, because the middle class generally get to become cozy with the kind of comfort that has been denied to it. And it is caught up in the processes of life and death, the survival of the families and so on and so forth. So a very important statement that is here is neither idealism nor free thought is possible for the middle classes. The middle class does not possess the liberality of aristocracy, because the aristocracy are free from burden of earning livelihood. So they are free, in order to, idealize the things. So, which is necessary to welcome and nourish an ideal. So you have to be liberal in terms of free to idealize the world, nourish the ideal. It does not possess the hunger for the new order. You see, because it has become cozy. The middle class becomes cozy. So cozy. So he says that it loses the hunger for new order, which is the hope on which laboring classes live. So only thing that laboring classes live on is the hope, isn't it? That the situation will be better, that the situation will be changed, isn't it? And he says, therefore, labor has a very distinct contribution to make in bringing about a return to the sane and safe ways of the past, which Indians had been pursuing to reach their political destiny. I think it's a very mystical sentence here. It's not an easy sentence to understand. I tried to understand it when he says labor has a very distinct contribution to make in bringing about a return to the sane and safe ways of the past. So which were the sane and the safer ways of the past in India? Sometimes I think, was he referring to the Buddha or Buddhism? I don't know, because we can only surmise, because it's not expanded, which Indians had been pursuing to reach their political destiny. And we know that in 1941, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar made it clear that only the Buddha can bring the democracy in this country. So my Buddhist mind is reading into it as Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar is saying that the submerged classes or the labor can resort to the safe and sane ways of the past, which Indians had been pursuing to reach their political destiny. Labor's ideal to India and Indians is to get into the fight and be united. And he said the fruits of victory will be independence and new social order. So first time he's talking about new social order. He has been talking about new order. Now he's talking about new social order. For such a victory, all must fight. Then the fruits of victory will be patrimony of all, and there will be none to deny the rights of united India to share in that patrimony. And this is what has happened in the history of the world. Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar has supported the democratic governments against Nazism. And when the World War II was ended, it was a time the transfer of power was taking place, but the ungrateful British Empire, was not ready to give the due rights to Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar's contribution to the world peace. And, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar had to again, go back to negotiation with the British. And, we see what has happened in the history afterwards. So I think this is a very interesting speech that is there to study for us even today in the context of today, and think through a lot of things, and think about how we can go forward. And the great responsibility has been given on the shoulders of the labor, which is undeniably includes the scheduled caste, the followers of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, and their capacity to give the leadership, because they can have the idealism, they can talk about the Prabuddha Bharat, they can talk about the classless India. At the same time, they have this hunger for change, hunger for transformation, hunger for new India, hunger for new social order. So I think this is a very interesting speech and very important speech today. So before we conclude today's reading class, we will open up our forum to discuss if there are any ideas that anybody would like to share. If there are any comments, when we end this session, all are welcome to comment. If there is nothing, I will take just 2 minutes.
There is a lot to chew and a lot to digest.
There are a lot of things to think through. So what I thought, before we end our class today, I will just give a summary in 1 or 2 minutes, that this is a very special speech that Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar gave on All India Radio, addressed to the country, to put a case forward of the labor to support in the World War II to the allies, who were almost all the democratic countries against Nazism and fascism. And he's talking about the fair conditions of life, which are liberty, equality, and fraternity. And he goes on define in a very characteristic and clear ways what constitute the fair conditions of life in terms of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And then he goes on talking about the Nazi New Order, which is about racial degradation, where Indians would have no place. They would be a survival class. And he goes on talking about how pacifism is not an option. He says that the end of war is important, but at the same time, just peace is very important, because there cannot be peace without justice. And he says that pacifism is not the way out. We cannot be indifferent to what is happening in the world. And then he goes on talking about nationalism, and he categorically defines nationalism, and he says that we shall not fetishize what is nationalism. And he says that some kind of a national sentiments is important to constitute a common community so that, the wheels of the democracy can be rotated, which is not otherwise possible. But then his vision is far bigger. It's about rebuilding and reshaping the life itself. And if anything standing in between reshaping and rebuilding of the life, he says that we should not accept it. And then he talks about what constitutes independence, how, independence is about new social order in the country and the new form of government, and, how that responsibility lies on the shoulders of each Indians. And then he goes on talking about, why, this war has to be won, so that, the liberty, equality, and fraternity should not just merely become the slogans. They should become the facts of life. And then he ultimately gives the responsibility to the labor to take a lead, because they have the idealism, and they have this, what is called the hope and the hunger for the new order and the new society. And he says that we should fight together against the forces which are against the liberty, equality, and fraternity. And if the victory comes, we can all share in that patrimony. So I think this is a very important speech that has been read today in class. So I hand it over to Nikhil before we end.
So I just wanted to thank everyone who was part of this session, and we'll be continuing next Sunday as well, same time, 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. And any feedback or any point, if anyone wants to highlight, they can highlight before we end the session.
Thank you, Nikhil. Thank you, Mangesh.
Thank you, brothers and sisters, and see you next week.
Thank you, everyone. Jai Bhim.
Jai Bhim.